So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah discusses the question of whether a Gentile, a non-Jew, is permitted to perform the mitzvah of Mila on a Jew. In other words, who is obligated, who is permitted to do the Mila. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah states that a guy is pasul for Mila. Let's say a doctor who is well versed in circumcision, and even if he knows how to do a circumcision like the tradition of the Jews, a medical circumcision isn't necessarily done in the same way. So the Gemara is clear that a non-Jew is not permitted to do the circumcision. It's a discussion in the Gemara, why not? The Gemara cites different psukim in terms of why a non-Jew cannot do it, but everyone's in agreement to the facts. So the Gemara wants to know, my nafkamina, what's the difference if you quote Pasuk A, you quote Pasuk B, or C? The Gemara cites different verses to why a non-Jew is not good. My nafkamina, what is the practical difference, as we always ask? The nafkamina is nashim. The nafkamina is whether a moheles, can a woman be a moheles? So depending on what the reason for a non-Jew is whether it has to do with the chi of Mila or not, so the Gemara goes to a whole discussion there. So it's a machlokas in the Gemara, and the Gemara's whole sugya talks about Sipora, Tavatikak Sipora, that Moshe's wife, if you read the simple reading of the Pasuk in Shmos, that she did the Mila. So that's the discussion in the Gemara. According to the opinion that a woman is poselis for Mila, how did Tipora do the Mila? So they give different answers. One answer is that she started it and Moshe finished it, or at least someone else finished it, and therefore we consider it like, the man. And the Gemara goes over there, has a whole discussion on it. So, halacha, so how do we paskin? Can a woman be a mohel? So it's clear a guy and Gentile cannot be a mohel. What about a woman? So actually it's brought down, it's a machokes in the Rishonim, and it's brought down, I think it's a discussion in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan has explained that since it's a machokes in the Rishonim on whether a woman can be a mohelet, so obviously all things being equal, we go with the man. However, b'shas hadchak, we know b'shas hadchak is the evidami, when you in the time of need, so then the poskim say one could use a moheles. What is considered a time of need? So I think the Shach brings down, let's say it's day 8, as the Torah tells us, Yom Hashmini Yimo Besar Alaso. On the 8th day, one has to do the Mila, and it's very important about Mila Bismana. We don't push it off. We have Zrizim Akdim in Lamitzvahs. We try to do it as early as possible, but it's significant that to try to do it on the 8th day. And even if you can't do it on the 8th day, so you try to do it as soon as possible. That's why there's a whole Nod of Yehuda has a discussion. He doesn't like the practice of, some had a practice on a Mila Shalom Bismana. Once they pushed off the Mila, obviously I guess it depends when it happened, but today, let's say, the question was, could I push it off until Sunday? Let's say I could do the bris on Wednesday, but you know what, I could get a lot more people on Sunday, or it's more convenient for me. Or in his case, he discussed pushing it off so you could have a Mila on Erev Pesach in order that the firstborns who are fasting could eat. That's the whole discussion whether a Mila Shalom Bismana warrants someone who has to fast to eat. And the Nodu, anyway, he was very against that practice. He says the Zachi of Kares are not doing Mila. One has to do it the first possible chance. You can't wait until Sunday or Erev Pesach. You got to do it as soon as possible. That's a whole discussion by Mila in terms of a Mila Bismana, Shalom Bismana. But the key is we do day 8 is a serious offense, not to do it. And therefore, the Shach writes, if you only have a moheles and not a mohel, and it's day 8, in order to fulfill the mitzvah mila bismana, that we view as a shat hadchak, as a time of difficulty, and therefore then it would be permitted to use a woman as a moheles. However, what about the following shaila? The poskim talk about the Rishonim. What about a Jewish mummer? What's a Jewish mummer? That's part of the discussion whether we have them today or not. Well, we definitely have them. The question is, what's their halachic status? A mummer is someone who basically doesn't keep the majority of mitzvahs. Today we have a concept of tinok shenishpa. Tinok, a child, shenishpa, that was taken captive. That's an expression. Someone who doesn't even know they're Jewish, doesn't know anything about Judaism, so therefore they're kind of like an onus. It's not their fault, and therefore perhaps they don't have the halachic status of a mummer for different halachas. But either way, so that's this further discussion. But the halach is a mummer. It's a discussion in the Rishonim, and many assume that a mummer cannot do Bris Mila. Why? Because the Gemara, as I'll talk about, in certain areas, someone, a full-fledged Jew, in certain areas, is treated ka'akum, is treated like a guy. In other words, it's not that no one says that, not everyone agrees, Yisrael shachati Yisraelhu. A Jew that sins is always a Jew, and that's not debatable. There's a whole discussion, they join another religion, and the Gemara discusses, but the average mummer, it's not a question. We know he's Jewish. However, and therefore you can't ask him to be your Shabbos guy, you can't ask him to turn on lights for you or do things on Shabbos. Oh, he's a mummer, it's Dino Kagai, and therefore you could sell your chametz to him. No, that's clearly a no-go. So that's not the issue. Is in certain halachas that apparently require a different level, either whatever the reason may be, but if the more mitzvahs to do, the different level of kedusha. That's the whole thing with the avos. As Rav Soloveitchik explained, the Ben Noach had Zayim mitzvahs b'nei Noach. It's a whole discussion what the status of the avos was kodem matan Torah. If you assume they were Yisrael, so they were Yisrael. If you assume they were a Ben Noach, the pashtus, so therefore each time Avram got Mila, Shacharis, each of the avos got another mitzvah to do, and therefore that raised the level of kedusha. So certain halachas, a mummer, a Yisrael mummer, is treated like a guy. So many Rishonim point out that he's usher to be the moel, because this is the Gemara says about a zara. A guy can't be a moel, and if a mummer is treated like a guy regarding the mitzvah of Mila, so then it would follow that non-observant Jew cannot be a moel either. So that's the opinion of many Rishonim, and that seems to be the psak in Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch writes, a Jewish mummer cannot be a moel. So the shiloh was that I heard from Rav Shechter. He said he had, I guess many years ago, there was, I guess one of his friends or someone he knew, I guess, who had smicha when he was became a chaplain, and he was out in, I think, the Philippines or somewhere there weren't too many Jews around, and he was married, he had a baby, and he had a baby boy. And the question was, what about the Mila? So there was only one person, there was a Jewish doctor who was a mummer who didn't keep any mitzvahs, and he wanted to know if he could use him to do the Mila. So they spoke to Rav Soloveitchik, and Rav Soloveitchik discussed it with his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, and Rav Moshe Soloveitchik told them that basically it's better to wait, whether it's 6 months, a year, till you get back to civilization, and you should do the Mila properly. You should do it with an observant Jew. And therefore, even though he wasn't, he didn't know the next time he was coming back, how However, he said, but in the discussion, we were talking about a rabbi who was committed to having the child circumcised. It was just a matter of when. So in a case where you definitely got to do the Mila, so then you could wait till you find someone who's appropriate to do the circumcision. However, Moshe pointed out, if you're dealing with a family which is only semi-committed, you're concerned that the longer you wait for the bris, they might decide not to do it. It's now 8 days old, the baby doesn't feel it as much, or you don't know if they feel it, but you get older and older, so it gets harder and harder to do the bris. If there's a concern that the bris won't happen, so then Rav Moshe says, then you can rely on Rabbi Kiva Eger quotes from the Gra, and it's a Tosas in Avodah Zarah, I believe, that a Jewish mummer is kosher lamila, so b'shas hadchak you can rely on that opinion. So lechatchila, and even more. So the Shach says b'shas hadchak it's enough that a moheles could do a meal on day 8, but the Rav and Rav Moshe Selevan thought that obviously a Jewish mummer is worse, is more of a b'diavad, and therefore better if you know you're going to do the Mila, better to wait. But if you know the Mila is going to happen, wait. But if not, it's a Shas Hadchak. If you don't think the family is going to be able to do it, so then you go ahead and you could have the bris done right away by a mummer. And in fact, this isn't just Mila is just one of the issues. Obviously, there's a discussion in the poskim regarding wine. So we all know there's halacha of yayin nesach, of stam yenim. If a non-Jew touches wine, so then it becomes prohibited to drink. And there are different types of wine. So there's a heter of yayin. It goes back to the time of the Gemara when they had wine libations, and the concern was he was going to use it for Avodah Zarah purposes. However, it's only the type of wine that can be brought on the Mizbeach. In fact, that's the whole discussion regarding Kiddush Friday night. That's the Rambam Shita, maybe some Sfarim Amakbet. Don't forget to use Yayin She'ino Mavushal Friday night for Kiddush, because that's the type of wine that can be brought on the Mizbeach. Yayin Mavushal, grape juice, all that stuff can't be used. So our minhag is that we do use that for Kiddush, but I think it's the Shitas HaRambam that one cannot. So therefore, it's a whole discussion. So Yayin Muvusha is not a problem. Today there's an issue. We have some of the wines are pasteurized. So therefore, that's the question whether that's considered Yayin Muvusha or not. That's a separate discussion. So the question is, we all know if a non-Jew's at the table, you can't serve Yayin She'ein Muvusha. In fact, I remember many years ago, when I was in Yeshiva University, just a student, and I don't remember all the details, but I know there was some big affair going on. Maybe the president or some prominent political figure was coming into town, and somehow there was a Jewish affair, and they called up YU. They wanted them to send over Jewish waiters in order to, obviously it was one of those $50,000 a head dinners, so at $50,000 you want to give them the best wine. Apparently, Yayin She'ein Muvusha is the good wine, and therefore you could give it to them. So there's a discussion among the poskim, what about Yisrael Mummer? Just like we know, we see that Yisrael Mummer is treated like a guy, and that's why there's an issue regarding a Bris Mila. Obviously a Bris Mila is a din daraisa, and there's much more room to be machmir. And plus, you can only do it once. I mean, you get into our toughest time bris, but basically, if you're going to do it once, you want to make sure you do it right. So it's not necessarily the same shaila, but similar issues in terms of having a mummer touching wine. So again, that's a discussion in the poskim. Many poskim. I think Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. I think Rav Shechter thinks the normative halach is that a Yisrael mummer should not be touching Yayin She'ein Muvusha, or else it's problematic. And obviously there's a tremendous debate today. Others say no, that it only applies to a guy, but not to Yisrael Mummer. And they get into the issue of Tinok Shenishba today. They really make, at least, perhaps it's only a Din Drabanan, that's a discussion, and therefore maybe the halacha of Yisrael Mummer wouldn't apply. It's a Tinok Shenishba, and therefore it's not a problem. So again, there's a major debate among the poskim. So obviously, it's best, you could avoid the question by not serving yayin she'eino mavusho when you're having, non-observant people at the meal, which touches on another shaila, another shiur, is inviting non-observant people to your meal on Shabbos or Yom Tov is a separate issue. But in terms of not having yayin she'eino mavusho, so that's obviously, since it's a major machlokas among the achronim, best to avoid the shaila by not having. If you have it, so then different discussion among the poskim whether you should be machmir or not. Different communities have different minhagim in terms of whether they accept it, whether they accept the opinion of Yisrael Mummer Rabbi Yayin, Bizman Hazeh, would or would not be an issue. So we'll discuss Mila b'Shabbos, the question of Mila on Shabbos and Mila on Yantif. So the Torah tells us, Yom HaShmini Yimo B'Sara Laso, on the 8th day, one has a mitzvah to do a Bris Mila, and the Gemara in Shabbos tells us, Ubiyom Afilu B'Shabbos. And as we learned on Sunday, the Taz, even though it's not, but it is based on Yud Gimel Midos, he learns that that's considered Mefurish B'Kra, and according to the Taz, that's the reason why we go ahead and do a bris on Shabbos. We don't apply Gzeira Derava, because as the Gemara tells us in Yevamos, Yesh Koach B'Yad Chachamim La'akor Dvar Torah B'Shevi Al Taseh, but that's only if it's something which isn't Mefurish B'Kra. But something which is Mefurish B'Kra, so then the Chachamim can't stop you. That's why they can't make a Gzeira on Rosh Hashanah Shema Yisakin Kli Shir, like the Bach writes. Because if you said Gzeira Shema Yisakin Kli Shir, you would never have shofar ever again, and they'd be Oker Mitzvah Lagamre. Like for a certain year, they could tell you for a certain time, a Horasha, like the Rambam writes, to cut off the leg to save the body. So that's what Chacham could do, but they can't do something on a permanent level. So we learned Mila is Afilu b'Shabbos, and certainly if you could do Mila on Shabbos, you could certainly do Mila on Yantiv as well. Yantiv Rishon and Yantiv Sheni, clearly. So that's no discussion. On Mila Bizmana, there's nothing to talk about. What about Mila Shelo Bizmana? Let's say it's not the 8th day. So if it's not the 8th day, it's day 9, 10, 11, it's Shabbos, so it's clear, it's a no-go. A Mila Shelo Bizmana is not Docha Shabbos. So Yom HaShmini, Davka Yom Shmini is Docha Shabbos, but not any other day. What about a Mila Shelo Bizmana on Yantif? So also on Yantif, we assume as well, we don't do a Mila Shelo Bizmana on Yantiv. However, regarding Yantiv Sheni, a Mila Shelo Bizmana, that's a Machlokas Rishonim. I believe a Machlokas, the Rambam and the Rush, regarding whether you do Mila Shelo Bizmana on Yantiv Sheni. So I believe the Rambam says yes, the Rush says no. What is the issue? What's the Nekudas HaMachlokas? Whether a Mila Shelo Bizmana could be done on Yantiv Sheni. So it could be based on the Machlokas and the Rishonim Achronim, what is the nature of the Takana, or what is the nature of the Din of Yantiv Sheni? Do we view it as a real Takana D'Rabbanan, or is this Minag Ba'alma, Minag Avoseim B'Yadechem? So if it's a Takana D'Rabbanan, so perhaps so a Mila Shelo Bizmana, we treat Yantiv Sheni the same way we treat Yantiv Rishon, and therefore we wouldn't do a Mila Shelo Bizmana. But if you hold it's only a minhag, so then b'makom mitzvah, even though it's not a Mila Bismana, but still a mitzvah, so we would do a Mila even a Mila Bismana. So halacha, the minhag is that we don't do a Mila even on Yantav Sheni. So the halacha, at least I think that's the practice in most places, if not all, that so a Mila b'Shabbos is docha Yantav and Shabbos. A Mila shelo Bismana, we say is not Yantav Sheni is a discussion, but the minhag is to follow not to do it. So that leads to a discussion among the Achronim. What about a suffix Mila Bismana? So clearly, if it's not a Mila Bismana, so then you could you wouldn't do it. But what about if it's a Vadai Mila Shelo Bismana? No, what happens if it's only of a suffix Mila Shelo Bismana? What's the case of a suffix Mila Shelo Bismana? So the classical case would be the Ben Hashmash's baby. Pick the day, whatever Yantiv falls out. But basically, if Yantiv Sheni falls out on day 8, so would you do? Would you do? Well, it's one in the suffix. It's day 8 or day 9. So would you do? So obviously we know halacha is when it falls out on Shabbos. Let's say a Friday twilight baby. So you can't do it Friday because maybe it's born on Shabbos. And you can't do it on Shabbos because maybe yesterday was the day. It's not a meal. So therefore you do it on Sunday. So what about a suffix Mila Shelo Bismana on Yantav Sheni? So then the post already talking about being lenient out the principle of Svek Sveka. Savek Daraisa L'Chumra, Savek Darabanan L'Kula, and Svek Sveka, so on a Svek Sveka, so the post Kimameko, because since according, I think it's the Rabbi who says you could do it anyway, even a Mila Shelo Bismana, so a Savek Mila Shelo Bismana, it's only Yantav Sheni, so then I think the Olam could be knowing to be Meko. And also as well, as the case in the Gemara in Shabbos on Kuf Lamed Hey talks about a C-section baby. So we had a machlokas in the Gemara whether you do a C-section baby day 1 or day 8. Because the issue was, because the Torah tells us in Parashas Tazria, the Torah has a juxtaposition between Mila and a woman becoming tameh, and also a woman only brings a carbon when it's a natural birth. She doesn't bring a carbon when it's a C-section baby. So the Gemara makes a drasha. When do we say Yom Hashmini? That's only if it's Vatama. So therefore, the question is, a C-section baby, in theory, where the mother does not become tameh and doesn't bring the special karbanos, would the halacha of Yom Shmini apply? So some say, yeah. We look at Avram Avinu, Yitzchak, there was no concept of Tuma and Tyra, and yet Avram did the meal on day 8. And other opinions know that it's true that was the halacha, but Nasna Torah v'Nishtan halacha. So basically, once the halacha, we do Mila because it was given on Sinai, not because of Avram. So even though that point's a definite, but nevertheless it's a sveika, because one could say, well, if that's the case, then it should be vadai that if it's based on that, then it should be maybe a vadai day 1 maybe. But halacha we view even though we do assume that the Rambam writes Yisod Gadol that we do Mila because it was given to Moshe, not because of Avram. Nevertheless, regarding Hilchas Mila, where we consider a C-section baby as a suffix, Mila Bismana. So normally, if day 8 falls out during the week, we do it on day 8 because there's no harm. If day 1 is the day 8's also good. And if it's day 8, then it's day 8. But if you do it day 1, and it's really day 8, so then you're doing it too early. So the shaila is on Shabbos. On Shabbos, you can't do it day 8 because it's a suffix Mila Bismana. As we pointed out, a suffix Mila Bismana you don't do on Shabbos. So therefore, you wait until Sunday. So perhaps over here we can make another svek sveika. If it's a C-section baby and day 8 falls out on Yontiv Sheni, Shagolios, so then perhaps based on the svek sveika, then we should be meko. That it's no different, the same like we had by a Ben Hashmash's babies. I think the poskim are meko, because then we apply the klal of svek sveika, and therefore it's okay. So a mila bizmana, do every day of the year. A mila shalom bizmana we generally don't do on Shabbos or Yontiv. A safek mila bizmana we do on Yontiv Sheni. We could be lenient since it's a svek sveik. According to some, you could do it anyway on Yontiv Sheni, even though we assume not. But maybe really it's a mila bizmana. It's only a safek mila bizmana, and therefore based on the svek sveiker we are lenient. So that's clear. So when it comes to a C-section baby on Shabbos, it's clear that there's no bris on Shabbos. So based on this, there's an interesting Rabbi Hananel in the Gemara Chagiga, I think Tav Yudalad, Tezvav, around there, the famous Gemara with bathhouse insemination. That over there they talk about, I think the Gemara Shiloh is can a Kohen Gadol marry a woman who, a pregnant virgin, as they call it, or something like that. So basically, so they discuss. What do you mean? That's oxymoron. I'm only a little bit pregnant. What do you mean you're a virgin? You're virgin and you're pregnant. So they talk about the potential of bathhouse. And so some learn into the Gadol, others take the Gemara, seriously, and the poskim discuss it lahalacha, and therefore, so the Gemara over there talks about it's not a normal. Bathhouse insemination is not a normal leda. The Gemara talks about there. It's a supernatural. It's not ordinary leda. So based on the Gemara, Rabbi Hananel, one of the Rishonim, is a big chiddush. He says if that's the case, then perhaps it doesn't have the din of Yom HaShmini, because only the conventional, only a normal mila, only a normal childbirth, uva Yom HaShmini Yom Asara Laso. But perhaps a bathhouse insemination, that's not considered a normal leda, and it's not Docha Shabbos. That's what Rabbi Chanano says. So it comes along with Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It says, what's the pshat in Rabbi Chanano? How do you learn Rabbi Chanano? Does he learn that Gemara because it was a nace? It was any miraculous birth is not categorized as a birth and regarding Mila and Shabbos and Karbanos. Is that what he's saying? Or no? He's just saying not that it's miraculous, but it's unconventional. Ma'inafkamina, either way, bathhouse insemination is either way, Mila is not Docha Shabbos and the one doesn't make a carbon. Yeah. He says that's true, but he says, what about it with modern technology today? What about artificial insemination, which isn't uncommon anymore? Or today with in vitro, all the types of modern technology now that of a woman who can't get pregnant through the natural means. So there are different ways for you go to different clinics, different things, and you try to work out ways to become pregnant. So the shaila is, what about a woman who became pregnant through artificial insemination, in vitro, etc., and the baby's born on Shabbos? Is that type of mila docha Shabbos? So Rav Shlomo Zalman, it depends on the two, how you learn the pshat in Rabbi Chanano. If you learn pshat in Rabbi Chanano, it's a miraculous birth. That's why it's not considered a normal birth. So artificial insemination isn't miraculous. It's very scientific. But if you say Rabbi Chanano is bathhouse insemination is unconventional, not because it's miraculous, so then it would come out that artificial insemination, isn't is different. Is considered, if it still is unconventional, because it's still, in other words, as the Gemara is saying, it has to be traditional relations between man and woman in order to have the kid to be a Yom HaShmini, and therefore, if that's the case, any type of in vitro audit would be out, and therefore that it would be included. Or no, it's only miraculous, but these things aren't miraculous. Science tells us it makes sense, and therefore it would have a din. So he's mesupik. I'm not sure if it's either, I forget if it's 2 days on Rabbeinu Hanano or if Shlomo Zalman's mesupik, what is the pshat? One of the two. Either way, so Rav Shlomo Zalman is notel l'chumra. He says we have to be, he's not sure, and he leans towards the one that it's only because it's, it could be because it's only unconventional, and therefore, he says one should not do a Mila on Shabbos. If it's in vitro artificial insemination of Shlomo Zalman Paskins, you should not do the Mila on Shabbos, you should wait until Sunday. I mean, it's a big chiddush, because this Rabbeinu Hanano is a big chiddush. Number one is, Rabbeinu Hanano is not usually a classical posek. What I mean is, he's definitely a classical Rishon, but he's not usually brought down as one of them. So, and yet Rav Shlomo Zalman thinks over here he is. And secondly, it's a tremendous chiddush because by C-section, the birth is different. You're not coming out; it's coming out of a different spot. But by the case of bathhouse insemination, artificial insemination in vitro, the birth is normal, the conception is done differently. So number one, it's a big chiddush to say that you apply it at all, even bathhouse, because I could say, like, what's the difference how the conception happened? The bottom line is, but we see, obviously we see that's not, we see Rabbi Hanano, that could be why maybe Avaji Yosef is one of the Achronim who are cholek on Rav Shlomo Zalman. He thinks you could do a Bris Mila on Shabbos for artificial insemination, etc. Rav Shlomo Zalman's against, and actually I've heard from Rav Herschel Schachter, as well as Rav Mordechai Willig, as well as Rav David Black, the contemporary halacha books, or either way, they're all, Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University, all Rebbeim of mine. They all, I heard them in different contexts. They all said to be machmer. To me, Rav Shlomo Zalman seems to be a big chiddush. The whole Rabbeinu Hanano seems to be a chiddush. So we don't usually pass like him, yet many of the Achronim, not Achronim, many of the today's, the poskim today, interesting, Amachmir on Avaji Yosef. Again, I don't think whether they go as they did. In other words, they say not to do it. If you actually did it, I don't think they'd say it would be a problem. Meaning, anyways, it's a general question. When let's say you do a Mila Shalom Bizman on Shabbos, Pashas the Mila is good. You just shouldn't, you just shouldn't have did it. So here they wouldn't have been. Here it's not even. Here it's only a suffix Mila Bizman, and so either they recommend not doing it. Interesting enough to say to be machmir, and that's what they. So that whole Rabbeinu Hanano is a big chiddush because he's changing conception. But we do, even though interesting, it's similar, but I don't know if it's connected to it. But we see as well that it's not just the birth. When it comes, and here is a din in Bris Mila. It's a different halacha. Like they have geiras, but we see everyone thinks it's so simple. Not everyone thinks, but some Achronim bring down that, and I think even Ramosha says, if a baby pops out of a woman, a Jewish woman, the baby's Jewish. But it's not so simple, because we see the Gemara in Yevamos. The Gemara talks about a Gentile who converts while she's pregnant. So the Gemara has a whole discussion. Did Beis Din know about it? In other words, it should be, what's the discussion? It's how you learn. There's a whole discussion. A pregnant Gentile who converts, so when they have the child, so does the child have to convert or not? That gets a whole discussion in terms of, you clearly have to do a meal anyway. That's a whole discussion. Is it a Mila L'Shem Geiris, or is it a Mila L'Shem Mitzvah? In that case, and that's a major shaila. do you need Yom Shmini or not? If it's a Mila L'Shem Mitzvah, then you got to wait for Yom Shmini. If it's a Mila L'Shem Gerus, then Pashas you don't. There is a Ratosis Kota or Rabbi Tam and Dochet, but there is some Shita that says Mila Shel Gerus has to wait a day. We don't assume that way, and it's just a singular Shita. I think Rav Shechter, like saying he was at a bris once with Rav Gifter, and he's saying it over to Rav Gifter. There's no way, there's no Shita like that. I mean, it's so far fetched. Obviously, and he showed him that it's a they quote a Rabbi Tam, but it's not a norm. It's not an accepted Shita. We assume a Mil L'Shem Gerus does not require day 8. That'd be a major nafkamina in that case. But what's my point? The point is, we see if it's all about the birth, then there's nothing to talk about. Clearly, the mother was Jewish when the child was born. So clearly, there is a concept being horabik kedusha. You have to be conceived. So so I'm just saying. So perhaps that's also Rabbi Chanano's working with a similar concept here. I mean, nothing to do with Geiris, but I'm saying is in terms of apparently he's saying it's not just the birth, but even for for to the din of Mila on Yom Shmini on Shabbos, it also has a din. So we're machmer in either direction. That we just go in all these cases, you have to be machmer and require a geiris. That if you can, it's a machokas rishonim. So therefore, you don't want to rely on a machokas rishonim to say the child is Jewish. So therefore, you might as well, So the meaning is we're machmer on many of these shaylas to cover ourselves. Those are major shaylas in terms of that. But that's the shayla here. So Mila b'Shabbos, only a Mila b'Zmana is Docha Shabbos, and so clearly a Mila b'Zmana, to summarize, is definitely good. It's good on Yontiv and Shabbos. A Mila Shelo b'Zmana is not good on Shabbos. We don't do it on Shabbos on Yontiv Rishon, and Machokas on Yontiv Sheni. We don't do it on Yontiv Sheni. However, a suffix Mila b'Zmana, i.e. a C-section baby, i.e. a Ben Hashmash's baby, to them the post can apply as Svek Sveka, and therefore we are lenient on Yontiv Sheni and a suffix Mila b'Zmana. And then we discussed the Chiddush of Rabbeinu Chanano based on the Gemara in Chagiga, that a bathhouse insemination, that it doesn't have a din of Mila b'Zmana. It's a big Chiddush because the C-section it's a different birth. You're being born differently, but he's applied even to the conception, maybe like we see by other cases of Geirus, and comes in Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Shechter and Rav Willig and Rabbi are all machmir, not to do a bris on day 8. Again, as Rabbi points out, you don't have to publicize why. It's no one's business that you did in vitro artificial insemination. They say you could do a white lie and say the baby's jaundice or some other reason why. And they say you probably should tell the moa, because I'm not going to say most moam don't know the halacha, but I'll say most moas aren't going to ask you. They'll just assume it's again, could be today, maybe they won't assume that anymore. I guess I don't know what the percentage is, but I know it's a lot less uncommon today about people through this modern technology, so therefore, unless you're Svard and you follow Rabbi Yosef, the minhag seems to be not to have a bris on Shabbos, even if the day 8 and the baby's healthy, if it was done through any type of medical intervention, i.e. artificial insemination or in vitro. There's a famous chiddush of the Dvar Avraham regarding a Mila Shelo b'Zmana, regarding a Mila not on the 8th day. We all know the Torah tells us, Yom HaShmini Yimo B'Sara Laso, one has to have a bris even on the 8th day, Afilu B'Shabbos. We don't apply the Klal Gzeira Derava like we do, no shofar, no lulav. Meal we have on the 8th day, whether it's Shabbos, Yom Kippur, Shabbos, when it's Yom Kippur and Shabbos on the same day. Every day of the year we do a Bris Mila, a Mila b'Zmana. A Mila Shelo b'Zmana is not done on Shabbos, because that isn't Tocha Shabbos, and therefore, and even a suffix Mila b'Zmana, i.e. a C-section baby, Ben Hashmash's baby, perhaps today with in vitro and artificial insemination. Those type of babies are considered a Safek Mila Bizmana, and we don't do the bris on Mila Shula Bizmana. We don't do on Shabbos or Yontiv. Yontiv Sheni seems to be Machokas, the Rambam and the Rush. Our minig is like the Rush, no bris on Yontiv Sheni. However, a Safek Mila Bizmana on Yontiv Sheni, so it's a Sveka, the post Kamalinian, to a C-section baby, a Ben Hashmashas, that we could do the bris. So let's say you have two babies that have to be gemalt, have to be circumcised. The one baby is a Mila Bizmana, and another baby is a Mila Shalo Bizmana. So which one takes precedence? Which one do you do first? I mean, it could be a nafkamina of a couple of minutes, but al pi halacha, which one do you do first? So that's a discussion in the poskim whether you go with the Mila Bizmana because they compare it to like the din of Tefillah, of Tashlumin, that by Tashlumin first you have the Iker, Chiyah, whatever Zmani Mincha is, you daven Mincha, and then if you Mishachar, you make it up afterwards. So perhaps the same thing here. The Mila Yom Hashmini, that's the Chiyah, and then the one that you have to make up, you missed. And it's day 10, 11, so then you do after. That's what someone suggests. But the Dvar Avram has a Chiddush, he says no. He writes, the Heicha Sheyesh Lafanav Shnei Yuladim Limo, when you have two children to circumcise, not your own, two different children, Echad Mila Bizmana, Echad Mila Shalo Bizmana, you have a Mila, one child that it's day 8, one child that's day 12. Adav Limo HaMila Shalo Bizmana, it's best to circumcise the one that it's day 12. Mila Mo HaMila Bizmana, then the day 8 baby. Shamila Bizmana. So why do you have to do a Mila Bizmana? Kolasi Blakdimo Eino Elo Mishim Zriza Magdim Elo Mitzvahs. So he says, really, day 8 is the whole day. When you have a Yom Shemini, the Chiyuv is to be done on day 8. There's no set time when it has to be done, but we have a general rule, Zriza Magdim Elo Mitzvahs, which we learn out from Ashkem Avram Baboker. And therefore we try to do the Mila as early as possible. Again, within reason, there's a famous Meiser of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Someone wanted him to be a Moel. No, someone wanted him to be a Sandik. At the bris, he said, sure. He said, well, I'm going to be davening at the Vasikin Minyan because reason Makdim and Lamitzvah. So Rav Shlomo Zalman said, no, okay, find another Sandik. In other words, the point being is, of course, reason Makdim and Lamitzvah, but it has to be within reason. So Rav Shlomo Zalman was busy learning all night, preparing, doing many other things. It wasn't something he felt you have to fulfill his reason, Makdim and Lamitzvahs. He didn't feel you had to wake up at Vasikin for that. So either way, it's only a din in his reason, Makdim and Lamitzvahs. Really though, if you did the Mila at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you didn't do anything wrong. You just, maybe it was just out to the Mila. Maybe as reason Makdimin, you should and that's what I think the Shvus Yaakov talks about on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Reason Makdimin, you should do it by Chatzos. I think he says is a cutoff point. So at least even within reason Makdimin Lamitzvahs, you have until Chatzos. Where does the Dvar Avram get this Chiddush from? Where does he know? But he's by a Mila Shalo Bizmana, Kol Rega. Every second you do it. Every second you don't do it, you are in violation of not doing a Mila Shalo Bizmana. So he gets this claims from a Rambam in Hilchas Mila, Perek Aleph Halacha Beis. What is the Rambam, right? V'chol Yom V'Yom Sheyavar Alav. Every day that passes and you don't do a bris, Misha Yigdal V'lo Yomo Es Atzmo. When you get older, when you become a bar mitzvah and you don't do it yourself, so we want to, even though the Rambam says B'chol Yom V'Yom, He wants to say the Rambam means korega v'rega. And that's how others are going to have. Mila shelo bizmana kol shaisa v'shaisa zimna. And that's what the Tshuva Mayava also writes that way. Shamia shelo bizmana overlove korega v'rega. So he says, what is the reason why we should do the bris Mila bizmana early? It's not a din in Mila per se. It's a din in Mila. It's a din in Zriza Magdim Lamitzis. So all things being equal, you should do Zriza Magdim Lamitzis. However, Mila shelo bizmana, that is a real din in Mila. That every second you don't do the Mila, perhaps you're violating Mavatal Mitzvahs Aseh. That's the Chiddush of Dvar Avram. It's a discussion, I think, I have to check, but I think most don't go with the Dvar Avram. And they go with the other Pshat that the Chova comes first. That's a discussion with their with the Dvar Avram, and other poskim discuss the issue. So that's a Mila shelo bizmana. So there's a whole discussion regarding Mila shelo bizmana. We said you can't do it on Shabbos. Is there any other day you can't do it? So, and then the Noda Yehuda, I don't know if he's working with the Dvar Avram or not, but he also feels strongly about doing a Mila shelo bizmana as soon as possible. He quotes, there was an old minig in some town, his town, that they used to do. See, today when we, on Erev Pesach, instead of the firstborn's fasting, they hear a siyam. That's the custom today. But back in the day in Noda Yehuda, they used to have a Mila. How could you, that's a discussion whether a Mila is a big enough Sudas Mitzvah, but how could you control a Mila happening on Erev Pesach? So in certain towns, if your towns are big enough, so it's likely it's going to happen. But the case was that people who couldn't do a Mila Bizmana because the baby was sick, it was a C-section, you couldn't do it on Shabbos, whatever the case may be, they used to wait until Erev Pesach. Again, so I'm not, I assume within reason, I don't know if they had the baby in Elul, they waited to Pesach, but I guess somewhere close to that time, I'm not sure what the cutoff point was, and maybe they waited to and they always wanted to have a bris on Erev Pesach, so they wouldn't have to fast. So no Yehuda screamed Chai v'Kayam against this custom. He says, what are you talking about? You can't. It's not once it's pushed off. It's pushed off. The Mila shelo bizmana, you have to do it. If you could do it day 9, so you got to do it day 9. You can't say, well, I missed day 8, therefore I'll do it day 15. And therefore he was very against this minhag. And therefore he says you have to do it as soon as possible. So that's the Shaila, Mila shelo bizmana on a Yom Chamishi. Could you do a Mila shelo bizmana on Thursday? Because there's a famous Tashbeit that says, in Mizdamin Mila shelo bizmana b'Yom Chamishi, Dochan oso ad l'machar k'dei shelo yachol shlishik Mila b'Shabbos. And you might have to end up Machal Shabbos. So the Tashbeit says, we learn, in fact, Rashi quotes in the beginning of Parshas Vayera, Yom Shlishi L'Milaso Haya. And therefore he says it was the third day of Mila, and that's the most painful. That's a discussion. Someday it's not just 3 days, it's every day, it's 1, 2, and 3. But the Tashbeit obviously only learns it's day 3 because he says you can do a Mila Shol Bisman on Friday. Others would suggest that how you wait until Sunday then. So that's the Shiloh. So, because the issue is, he says that since on Yom Shlishi is the most dangerous time, it's a din of sakana, and therefore you'll be allowed to machal Shabbos, but you don't want to put yourself in a situation where it's going to take away Chil Shabbos, Bitu Oneg Shabbos. That's the famous machokes, the Ramban and the Baal Amor regarding someone knocked over during the days of the Gemara Mishnah. For the health of the child, they used to wash hot water, and therefore they used to wash the hot water, boil the hot water before Shabbos to put on the child. So the discussion was, what about if someone kicks over the water? So if you already did the Bris Mila and the child's in danger, there's no water, so of course you have to machal Shabbos to heat hot water. But let's say someone knocked over the water before the bris. So that's a machokas, the Ramban Baal Amor. The Balamor says, Ein Locha Mitzvah. The Ramban says, Ein Locha Mitzvah L'Shaitza. You have to do a mitzvah right away. You don't have to make cheshbonos. Let the chips fall where they may. So I'll go heat up hot water if I have to. And according to the Balamor, no, you have to be Roes HaNolad. You have to be able to see in the future. And since you know you're going to have to be Machal Shamis, so therefore wait until Sunday. That's where the Machaber passes into Shulchan Aruch. There's a stira, there's a kasha. The Gemara says in Shabbos regarding not taking a boat trip more than 3 days before, or not 3 days before. The concern is you're going to need help on the ocean. You're going to be a Machal Shabbos. Some say Bittul Onik Shabbos. The riff over there. So however the Gemara says Var mitzvah it's mutter, but for mitzvah purposes you can. So the shaila is, Mila is a mitzvah, so how come we don't, so why are we worried about Bittul Onik Shabbos, or that, if we're not worried about it regarding going on a business trip. So that's what they want to make distinctions, that the case of the Mila, you know it's going to happen. It's happening like, it's going to happen the next second. Here is, so you're doing it on Shabbos. So when you're doing it on Shabbos, you have to worry about the consequences of Shabbos. When you're doing something on Thursday or Friday, L'Dvar Mitzvah, you don't have to. And others point out as well, one's a suffix, one's a vadai. Basically, the child's a cholash eish bo sakana. You're going to have to be marchet and a sakatan. But a boat ride, you're not sure if it's going to happen. Either way, that's a discussion. But regarding that issue. Whether Bisman Hazeh, our ships, our cruises fall under that category that we can no longer take a cruise on 3 days before Shabbos. But regarding here, we pass like the Balamor, but it's not really Lamaisa, since today we don't wash the child anymore, not because we don't care about the safety of the child. There's no need for it. Today we have septics, antiseptic, we have things to take care. We put on the child for infection better than hot water, and therefore it's not an issue today, because it's clearly, that was even the Beis Yosef, right, who lived in the 1500s, so I don't know how much his sanitary times were better than the Gemara. Apparently they were, and definitely can't compare to our times where he says it's no longer needed. So clearly he learned it's a pure health issue, and therefore it was a pure health issue and it doesn't apply, so you don't have to keep it. That's exactly part of the Nakuda regarding Mitzitza. Mitzitza, the Gemara says, seems to be a health issue. So that leads some Achronim to discuss whether Bisman Hazeh, the Mitzitza, not only perhaps isn't, that's part of the discussion, what the Gemara means. Maybe there are other factors to it as well. But if it's only a pure health issue, so then maybe we could get rid of Mitzitza. So there are those who suggest that, but well, halacha, no reputable mole will not do Mitzitza. Everyone agrees to do Mitzitza today. Is whether you do it Pepel Bakli, but that's a separate discussion. And this, one last thing on the Inyani Bris. So, there's a famous medrash regarding David HaMelech, that when David HaMelech was in the Beis HaMerchat, he said, Aylana, woe to me, I can't, he felt so bad, he couldn't do any mitzvahs. Until he looked at his Makam Hamila, he remembered his Makam Hamila, and he was Nishyashev Daito. And he said, well, okay, the Mila, okay, so therefore he felt better. Alright, what the Shaila is like, what do you mean? He just did the Mila today? So what was the Nishyashev Daito about? So, they point out that there's a famous Maharach or Zarua's son, that points out, we know there's a klal of Osek b'mitzvah pater min ha-mitzvah. When you're involved in mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. But a Makayim mitzvah isn't. So therefore, even though David, you always have your Mila, so you're not exempt. The Chiddush of others, the Bris Mila says it, that the two dinim by Mila. There's the din, the mitzvah, the Maisa Chaticha, and then you have a Chalo Shein Mahol, you're considered a Gamal, so that's also an Indian. So therefore, apparently it was Nisyashev Daito, he was a change of Chefsa, that he was no longer an Aro, he became a Gamal. That is a transformation, and therefore that's what David was able to establish. The Shaila is, why Dafka Mila? Like, why not some other mitzvahs? Why not? He looked at its payas. He looked at other things. Why specifically Mila? So the Baal Shem Tov explains that really it wasn't Mila per se. It's not a physical thing. That he was in the base, maybe he was, but that's not the meaning. The Gemara is that he was doing his bodinus, a self-examination. In other words, how many mitzvahs do I really have? I do mitzvahs shalol lishma, I do it for ego, for pride, for PR, whatever I do mitzvahs. Like, he's looking through all the mitzvahs he does and he has nothing left. There's no mitzvahs he does that really does purely for the sake. And then he's thought about the Mila. Mila, 8 days old baby. No, they don't know what kavanah they have, but it's definitely not with any ulterior motives, and also it's not very forced. But either way, the Baal Shem Tov writes that represents a pure mitzvah lishma. So that Mila, that's the one Mila I could take with me anywhere I go, and therefore this Yashev Daito. And that's what the Hasidic Rabbeim say on the Pshat. We say it every bris. Kishem shenichnas lebris, kein yichanes leTorah ulechofa ulemasim tovim. Just like we enter in the bris, and the bris, the aspect is totally lishma, so too I should have a lishma in Torah chupa masadov. Of course, you're not going to have a lishma in everything, but at least we should try to pick one aspect of a mitzvah to try to have a lishma. Something meaningful. That's why the famous Netziv, the Torah talks about the bris. Besides, it's himo yimo, the mitzvah, the ma'isa mila, but it's brisi olam. It's something forever, because it's something forever. Why? Because that was done lishma, and therefore, what's done lishma, we know if it's done lishma, it's very lasting. That's how the famous Sherman Schwab has a piece explaining when Bilam wanted to curse the Jews, so when he was going to go free, God didn't let him go, based on Rashi there. But when he took money, so God said, okay, go. So what's the pshat? He's interested in Bilam's parnasa? The answer is no. That if Bilam was doing it for the money, so he really wouldn't be into it, so it wouldn't be that powerful. But watch out for the shmonics. We don't have to look around too far today with the people, suicide bombers. They might have the wrong cause. Not they might, they do. But they believe in the cause, and someone who believes in their cause, whether it's an erroneous cause or not, it's a very powerful thing, and that's what they came to. It's like bris is a lishma. That's why it's brisi olam. And so too, when we enter Torah chuva masan tovim, we should each try to find the lishma in our mitzvahs, and so for not only the bris should be a brisi olam, that all our mitzvahs should be a brisi olam. We know Avram was commanded the mitzvah of Mila, and we'll be discussing Mila for the next couple of weeks. And the Mefarshim asks, the Gemara tells us in Yuma, on Daf Chav Ches, on Daf 28, that we have a tradition regarding the Avos, that the Avos were Makayim, or at least Abraham, but we'll see the Avos as well. Avram was Makayim, Kol HaTorah Kulo Kodem Shenitna. The Gemara tells us in Yuma that Avram kept the whole Torah even before it was given. Afilu Eruve Tavshilin, that's the example the Gemara gives. Even Eruv Tavshilin, which the Meshech Chachma points out, it's not coincidental, that example, because in terms of what do you use an Eruv Tavshilin for? So you could cook on Yantav, for Shabbos, Aknas Zarcham. That was the Yisod of Avram Avinu doing Chesed. So either way, the example is a din d'Rabbanan. Apparently, whatever that means, on that level, they kept everything, even the biblical and rabbinic laws. Through Nevuah, he was able to figure it out. So the question is, however, when it came to one mitzvah of Mila, he waited for its tzivoi. Instead of volunteering circumcision on his own, I guess instead of volunteering circumcision on his own, he waited for a commandment from God to do it. And the question is why? Why was Mila discriminated against? How come by all the other mitzvahs, Avram apparently volunteered on his own and didn't wait for a tzivoi? Yet when it came to Mila, he waited for a tzivoi, a commandment, before he did it. So there are many answers. One is from Rav Nissen Alper and others. Just a simple explanation is, by definition, a bris is a covenant, a contract. It's not very meaningful to have a contract with yourself. I mean, for some people it helps when, I guess, the Bali Mustara, you have goals and stuff on a certain level, but in terms of a commitment to others, you basically need two. So therefore, basically, it's a bris ben absarim. So Avraham Avinu basically wanted to make a contract. He needed two people. That's just a simple explanation. Others explain, we know there's a biblical prohibition of chavala, of chovel, to damage yourself, to cause harm to oneself. That's why you can't just decide to cut off your finger one day, cut off your arm, your leg. I won't get into abortion now, but we don't have a right just to injure ourselves and do things, because it's not our body. It's our body, but it's a gift from God. We just have rights of usage, not to abuse.
Yes, the false Messiah who was eaten made his soldiers cut off their fingers, and that's how the rabbis knew he was a Mashiach Sheker. What's his name? He did a rebellion against the Romans.
Or being drafted into the Tsar's army.
Yes. Who am I talking about?
Who is that?
The famous...
The Romans?
The famous rebel against the Romans.
Yeah, but in that case, maybe...
The Roman army.
Yeah.
That's how they knew he wasn't Jewish, you mean?
No, that's how because he ordered his followers to prove their fidelity, his Jewish followers, by cutting off their finger. And that was a giveaway that he wasn't...
Right, I guess it depends unless it was a big enough tzarech or not, but right, Pashtus, right, but we'll get to it. So Chavala is an Issa Darais, is a biblical prohibition. So normally, if it's not for the mitzvah of Mila, if there wasn't a mitzvah of circumcision, it would be prohibited to do. You have no right to do nivel to your body. So therefore, and in fact, even Mila on Shabbos is a chiddush, because you're causing blood, you're causing a wound. That would be a biblical prohibition. If not for the special pasuk that we could do Mila on Shabbos, and for the special pasuk we have a mitzvah Mila, it would be prohibited. So that's why Avram couldn't do Mila, because there's no harm of putting on talis or tefillin. There's no prohibition per se, but causing harm to your body is, and therefore Avram was prohibited from doing this. It's only once the mitzvah meal was given, then you're allowed to. That's how some explain. Others explain, the Vilna Gaon, the Maral Midiskin, that we have a principle in the Talmud, Gadol ha-mitzuva v'yoseh misha'eno mitzuva v'yoseh. Even though it might sound counterintuitive, you much prefer your kids to do things before you have to tell them. But there's halacha that greater is the schar, greater is the reward for the one who is commanded and does it, the one who volunteers to do it. And of course, as Tosfos points out in Kedusha, on a certain level, volunteering is a higher level, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, what does it mean, the Gemara? It's much harder to do. When you have to do something, the pressure is on you, it's much more difficult to do than if I just feel like showing up and doing it. And that's why it's Gadol HaMetzuba. That's why we know there's something called child psychology, that when the kids reach a stage where they just do the opposite of what you tell them. So therefore, you tell them the opposite. Of course, the question is, at what point does the mitzvah of chinuch kick in, and to teach your kids you have to listen to your parents, not do the opposite. But either way, but we see, whether you're an adult or a child, no one likes to be told what to do. They like feeling they're doing it on their own. And therefore, it's a greater schar, Gadol HaMetzuva, knowing you have to do it. So therefore, as a general rule, so the question is, so why couldn't Avram, what does it have to do with Avram not doing the Mila before he was commanded? He did the talis and tefillin before he was commanded. He did all the other mitzvahs. So the answer is because Mila is a one-time shot. You only can do Mila, at least you only can cut off the Arlo ones, whether taking off blood, Atavas Bris, that's a separate discussion. But you only can do the mitzvah once. And we all know that if you're going to do the mitzvah once, you want to do it properly. And therefore, by the other mitzvahs you can do, the fact I put on tefillin today doesn't take away no difference. In fact, because we know we should feel like it's the first time every day. The fact that I kept Shabbos last week has nothing to do with me not keeping Shabbos this week. As they say, it's not tshuva that obligates you to keep Shabbos next week. It's nothing to do with tshuva. Because God says we have to keep Shabbos. So it has nothing to do with doing tshuva. Not the same obligation of keeping Shabbos always applied. So talis and fill, but by Mila it's a one-time shot. So if you're going to do the Mila, that's Gadol HaMetzuva V'Yosi. You wanted to do the Mila In fact, that's how the Be'er Yosef or Yosef Salan explains one pshat. There's many. Why was it that the Torah tells us Be'elo Nei Mamre that Hashem came to visit Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and the Rashi tells us Husha Nasango Eiza Al Hamila. He gave him advice about the Mila, like who's Mamre? Like let's go see. God told me to do the Mila. Like who cares about that? Let me see what Mamre has to say on the issue. Like what does that mean? He has Mamre. So there are many explanations why he has Mamre, but one is that there are different parts to the mitzvah of Mila. There's the actual Mila, the cutting off of the foreskin. Then what we call the Priya, revealing the membrane, and then we see that maybe there's a tufei damo having blood. So the lach is mal v'lo para ki'ilu lo mal. If you do Mila, so Avram knew that down the line when Yoshua inherits Israel, they're going to give us the mitzvah of Priya. So his question was, should he do just Mila or should he do Priya? He wasn't sure. He knew that the mitzvah Priya was going to come later, so that was his issue. I don't know how necessarily Mamre would help him out on that, but according to that was the Shaila. And then also got into whether you should do some explain, should he do it publicly or privately, because he was into Kiruv Rechokim. He was into trying to get people to believe in ethical monotheism. So then he said, if I'm different, then people might stay away from me. And people say, Derek Drush, more as a joke and Drush, but they say because we know how it is. For some people, if the Torah says it, the rabbis say it, that's not so important. But if a non-Jew says it, wow, it must be important. God says it, do Mila, okay, I'll think. But Mamre says it, I'm in. So either way, whatever the reason is, Mamre played a role in the Mila, but so they point out that there was different aspects. The different parts of the Mila. So the Mila Priya and the Tufei Dama. So that's the explanation. Gadol HaMatzuva V'yoseh, Misha Eino Matzuva V'yoseh. And then there's another explanation, a famous explanation from the Bris Rav. The Bris Rav points out that if you look at the Psukim on the commandment of Mila by Lech Lecha, it says that Abraham bowed down to, when God appeared to Abraham, he bowed down, Yipal al Panav, he went down on his face, etc. And Rashi writes because he felt incomplete, he didn't have a Mila, he wasn't a Tamim yet. So the question is, this isn't the first time God spoke to Avram. We don't find anywhere that Avram went down all the other times. The Sifrei Chacham says, yeah, it doesn't say it, but it happened. So the Bris Rav others want to suggest a different explanation. That's not the pshat. So we know, how does one get the status of an aro, of an arla? And that used to be the big curse word during the time of the Mishnah Gemara. We've come a long way from them, but the big curse word is called someone you aro you. So, how do you become an aro? So, is it just a physical fact? I never did a physical circumcision, or it's more than that? So the Bris Rav explains that it's the mitzvah. What came first? The whole chicken or egg question. So he says it's the mitzvah of Mila that creates the status of being an aro. It's not the mere fact that you have a big deal. You have a foreskin. What's wrong with it? Everyone has the foreskin. If there's no mitzvah of Mila, there's no problem of having a foreskin. So it's the mitzvah of Mila that creates the status of an aro being a bad thing, and therefore, and then you have a mitzvah to cut it off. That aspect. So he points out like this. So up until the commandment of Avram being commanded in Mila, we asked, why couldn't Avram volunteer a Mila? Because it made no sense. He wasn't an aro yet. There's no problem. It's meaningless. Like, I just feel like cutting my finger today. Like, okay, good for you. Are you nuts? But so it's only because he had a mitzvah of Mila. In fact, it's a famous kasha that Chasim Sofer. He asked, who did Avram's Mila? So we know apparently Avram did it. But the question is, it gets into the whole question, what was the status of the Avos Kodem on Torah? But the simple pshat, he was a non-Jew, he was a Ben Noach. And we know that Lach is a guy can't do his circumcision. So how could Avram do his own circumcision? So there's a lot of shtickles on it, the Minchas China, but the Chasim Sofer writes, that's why he waited. It was the mitzvah of Mila Once he got the mitzvah of Mila, he got the status of a Jew, and therefore he couldn't do. That's why only Avram is able to do. That's why a regular ger is not allowed to do his own circumcision. Not that I'm recommending it anyway, but he points out it's the mitzvah of Mila that gave him the status of being a Jew, and that's why he was able to do it. But
it sounds like a contradiction.
Even the mitzvah of Mila made him an Arel.
Right.
It also.
Right. No. So Yisrael Aro, he's assuming could do it. The luck is Yisrael Aro can be a Moel. So therefore, that's how he's explaining.
Arel can.
Right. Again, in the Minchas Chinuch writes it's Ban Ke'echad. It happens at the same time, the moment you're doing the Mila. But either way, so getting back to the Bris Mila, so he says it's a mitzvah Mila that creates the status of an Aro. And therefore, where does he get this from? It's actually, there's a Yerushalmi, there's a Rabbeinu Tam, there's a discussion in the Gemara Yavamas about an Aro is not permitted to eat Truma, an Aro Kohen that is, someone who's a Kohen who normally is allowed to eat Truma. Aro Kohen is not permitted to eat Truma, he can't eat the Karban Pesach, etc. So what about the following scenario? A tragic case of Mesu Achiv Machmas Mila. Let's say someone has a son, they do a circumcision, the child dies, hemophilia, they can't stop the bleeding. It happens the second time the child dies. So the halacha is, for the third child, no circumcision, no Mila. Again, to the discussion, if the child gets older and better, you might be able to do it later, but definitely no circumcision on day 8 or not for a long time. So the question is, what is the status of this child? Halacha, if you intentionally say, I'm not doing a Mila, you're clearly an Aro. But let's say halacha forbids me to do a Mila. If I'm a Kohen, could I eat Truma? Could I eat from the Karban Pesach? That seems to be a machlokas Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Rashi still considers you an Aro, and Rabbeinu Tam says, no, you're not an Aro. So what's in the Kudas HaMachlokas? There's different ways to learn the issue, but the simple pshat is Rashi learns that basically he's still chayiv in the mitzvah of Mila, but since he's an Anas, so therefore he's still considered an Arab. Well, he's never an Arab. What can I do? He can't do a Mila, but he's still chayiv in Mila, and therefore he's still an Arab, and therefore he can't. And Rabbeinu Tam clearly holds like the way the Bris Mila was saying. The Bris Mila holding like Rabbeinu Tam, but that, in other words, it's the mitzvah of Mila that creates the status of being an Arab. If I don't have a mitzvah of Mila, I'm not an Aro. So therefore, it's okay for the Kohen to eat the Truma and to eat the Karban Pesach. This goes back even to a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi discusses a day 8 baby, or before day 8, let's say he's a Kohen. So there's halacha, you can't rub the baby with oil shel Truma. You can't get benefit from the Truma. So it's clearly up until day 8, everyone agrees you can, because the mitzvah Mila doesn't begin until day 8. The Shaila in the Yerushalmi is Leil Shmini. What about the night of day 8? So up from 1 through 7, everyone's in agreement. There's no mitzvah Mila yet. So this child could still get benefit from the Truma. He's not an Aro, the Kohen. But what about day 8? Certainly no. The Shaila is what about the Leil Shmini? Because we all know Yom HaShmini, he can't do a Mila until the morning. So the Shaila is, how do we view the nighttime? Do we say basically the mitzvah Mila begins at night, but for technical reasons, the Torah tells me of a Yom, I can't do it at night, and therefore, but the mitzvah began, and hence I have the status of an Aro, or no? Yom HaShmini, the mitzvah doesn't begin into the day, so therefore the nighttime, I don't have an Aro. And we find this issue by the Gemara in Sukkah, by Dichoy B'mitzvahs. Rashi talks about it in Sukkah, and others about, there's a halacha about, let's say, they talk about hadassim, or let's say I'll talk about it by shofar. A shofar shel avodah zara, you can't use. A shofar used for avodah zara is prohibited for usage for the mitzvah. However, there's a halacha of a guy can mevatel. If a guy is mevatel the shofar, mevatel the avodah zara, then it can become mutter. The shaila is, let's say, at Ben Hashmashas of Leil Rosh Hashanah, it was still avodah zara, and the guy was mevatel later on, let's say that night, and the next morning it's okay. And we know the mitzvah of shofar doesn't begin until the morning. So the question is, could I use that shofar shel avodah zara, or hadassim that were pasul now became kosher? They were pasul ben hashmashas, but the next morning they were okay. So the Rashi writes, no, it goes by ben hashmashos of the night before. And the shaila is why? If the mitzvah doesn't begin until the day, So we see apparently the mitzvah of lulav begins at night. It's the same day, except it's a technical reason, and same thing with shofar. So if that would follow, that's where the Yerushalmi is getting at it, that even Leil Shemini, the night before, it becomes an issue. In fact, that's a kasha, let's say, a ger, someone who wants to become a Jew, but for health reasons he can't do a Mila. In fact, we had that case. What was that Italian guy who wanted to get a Mila?
Oh, yes.
He's
yes.
So the question is, he has a diabetic. So we know a Jew, even without a Mila, is still a Jew. Yisrael Aro, it's not a good thing if you're an Aro if it's intentional, but you're still a Jew. What about a guy who wants to become a Jew but he can't get a Mila? Because we know part of the conversion process is Mila, Tefillah, Kabbalah, HaMitzvahs. So what's the story of so Rav Chai, so what's the issue? Whether a guy could be a guy who halakhically or that says you can't do a Mila, does he have a shame oro on that? In other words, do I view him kind of like the machlokas Rashi or Reino Tam by Meisu Achav Machmas Mila? But the halacha tells you not that you can't have a Mila. Do you have a status of an oro? Chaim Ozer Gruzinski Paskins, no, you can't. You go with Rov. You shouldn't go with Rashi over Rabbeinu Tam, and you cannot accept a ger, even if health reasons you can't have a Mila. But if you can't have a Mila, so therefore that would be a ma'ak. It's different than the shiloh of a Jew, because this should be an aro. So that's how Rav Chaim. So this to summarize, we had the famous kasha. Why did Avram wait for a tzivoy? Why didn't he volunteer it? Either you need two for a contract. Secondly, a chaval, without the heter of having a milah, would be usher to do a milah because you can't harm yourself. Number three, gadol hametzuva v'yos, you only can do it once, and you better do it right. And number four, the bris karav, it's the mitzvah of milah that creates the size of an aro. Until he got the commandment, there was no mitzvah, you weren't an aro.